Welcome back to Mr. Slover's Math. Today we're going to talk about graphing a linear equation again, except there's going to be a few catches. It's not going to be as straightforward as we did in the previous lesson where we were given the slope and the y-intercept. So the warm-up is getting us ready for what we're actually doing today in the lesson when we graph. The m is the slope, the rise over the run, the b is the y-intercept. Now number 2 in the warm-up is getting us ready for putting things in y equals mx plus b form. We did not spend a lot of time on literal equations, but that's what example 2 is, where you're solving for a specific variable. So for all of these, we are solving for y. The reason we're doing that is because we're trying to get it in slope-intercept form, and slope-intercept form is always y equals mx plus b. Now you have that rare occasion when it's a vertical line, which we'll get into, but otherwise we're solving for y. So for all of these, we want to add or subtract the x term first. Okay? It doesn't matter whether there's a negative, a positive, fraction, or even if there's a decimal with that x term. You want to add or subtract it first. Once that's done, then you're going to go ahead and divide by whatever the coefficient of y is. I know that looks like a letter G, but it's really saying y. And you divide every single term in there. And we're going to talk about that on letter D. So right here we have negative 3x plus y equals 10. My goal is to get the y isolated all by itself. So I'm following these two steps. There's only two steps. It is a negative, so I'm going to add 3x to both sides. Now, just like I wrote in red, these are not like terms. A 10 and a 3x are not like terms. They will stay separate. One has a variable, one does not. That's the very basic definition of why they're not like terms. So we just leave it, y equals 3x plus 10. Similar for B and C. Now in letter G is different. Step 1 says add or subtract the x term. Well, there is no x term over here. Okay, it's just 3y. So that means we skip step 1 and we go straight to step 2 where it says divide the coefficient of y, and we divide everything. What I mean by everything is literally that. So 3y divided by 3, 2x divided by 3, negative 6 divided by 3. Every single term is divided by 3. So we get y equals, and just like I have here in red, you want to leave that as a fraction because the end goal is we're probably going to have you graph. If it's a decimal, it's not so easy to graph. If it's a fraction, way easier to graph. So we're going to leave it as 2/3 x and then the minus 2. So this is what we're doing for part of the lesson down here. And it says, rewrite the following equations in slope-intercept form, then identify the slope and y-intercept. Pretty much it's the same thing as the warm-up, except I'm adding in identifying the m and the b. So my two steps for success are still the same. Add or subtract the x term, and then divide everything by the coefficient of the y. So I add 3x to both sides. These are not like terms. One has a variable, one does not. Divide everything by 2, and notice I'm leaving it as a fraction. Y equals 3/2 x plus 3. I left it as 3/2 x. Okay, that 3/2 x tells me that is my slope, 3/2. There's my y-intercept. Letter B is very similar. So now example 2 is I'm solving for y, putting it in slope-intercept form, and then I'm graphing. Okay, so in order to get from here to here, there's a few things we got to do. We have to identify we got to solve for y first, identify the m and the b, and then graph it. So I want to look at letter B. It says 3x plus y equals 0. Some students see that equals 0 and are like, well, Mr. Slover, we can't do anything with that. There's no solution. Well, we're not trying to find a solution. We're just trying to graph something. So I'm subtracting 3x because just like the two steps before, that's what we got to do. add or subtract the x term, and then we need to get the y all by itself by dividing. So subtract 3x. 0 minus 3x is just negative 3x. That's it. Right? So y equals negative 3x. So my slope is negative 3, or negative 3 over 1. I'm writing it as a fraction because I need to graph this. Then my y-intercept is 0. I know that because there's nothing after the x. So it's a 0. So that means I start at 0, the origin, and I go down 3, right 1, because my slope is negative 3 over 1. It's rise over run. So because it's negative, I'm going down. Because it's positive in the denominator, I go right. Similar for A and C. Now the last part of the notes are the special equations, if you will. So yes, we want them in y equals mx plus b form, but what if it's just a y equals a constant or an x equals a constant? Hey, what does that mean? Well, that means you have a special type of line, either a vertical or a horizontal line. So the first one says y equals 8. This represents a horizontal line. If it's just y equals a constant or y equals a number, it is a horizontal line which goes left to right. The 8 tells me where it crosses the y-axis. The slope is 0. There is no slope. It's 0 slope for a horizontal line. So I go up 8 on the y-axis and I draw a horizontal line left to right. Letter B is a vertical line. It's just x equals a constant. So x equals a number. In this case, anytime you have vertical lines, your slope is undefined. Okay, mathematically, we saw this a few days ago. When you have a vertical line, you have 0 in your denominator. You can't divide by 0, so that means your slope is undefined. Now, there is no y-intercept because typically it does not cross the y-axis. There's only one case where it would, but the good news is I'm not ever going to give that to you. So my vertical line, for purposes of this class, will never cross or will never intersect the y-axis, which is why I will never ask you to list the y-intercept of a vertical line. And then letter C is another horizontal line. I just didn't write it, but we're back to y equals a constant or y equals a number. So this time it's negative. So I count down 4, put a dot, and draw a line left to right. So if need be, you need to solve for y with those 2 steps. You add or subtract your x term and then divide every term if you need to. Identify